The basement of the Waldorf Astoria was never meant to exist on any official blueprint. It was a subterranean fortress of mahogany, velvet, and absolute secrecy, accessible only by a private elevator that required a coded key and a nod from a man who had killed more people than most soldiers. On the night of April 12, 1956, the air inside this chamber was a suffocating fog of premium Havana tobacco and the sharp, medicinal tang of high-end gin. Frank Costello sat at the head of the baccarat table, his presence commanding the room without him ever having to raise his voice. He was 65 years old, but in the dim, amber glow of the crystal chandeliers, he looked like an eternal monument to underworld authority. Around him sat the invisible government, a Supreme Court justice, a high-ranking dock union official, and two rival capos from the Brooklyn families. This wasn't just a game of chance, it was a high-level summit disguised as a gamble. In the center of the table sat a mountain of chips and stacks of high-denomination bills that totaled exactly $1 million. It was a pot large enough to start a war or buy a presidency. Costello looked at his cards, his face a mask of granite, and pushed a final stack of black chips into the center. He was doubling down, betting his pride and his dominance on a single turn of the felt. But as his fingers left the chips, the heavy atmosphere of the room didn't just break, it exploded. The sound was a thunderous, bone-shaking crack that seemed to rip the oxygen right out of the room. The reinforced oak doors, designed to withstand a battering ram, were obliterated by a Focus C4 breaching charge. Splinters the size of daggers flew through the air, embedding themselves in the expensive wallpaper and the flesh of the unlucky guard standing nearest to the entrance. Before the echo of the blast had even faded, for figures in heavy wool overcoats and ballistic masks stormed through the swirling grey dust. They weren't shouting like amateur stick-up kids, they moved with the rhythmic, terrifying precision of professional executioners. They carried short-barreled trench guns and snub-nosed revolvers, their muzzles sweeping the room in a lethal arc. The lead gunman, a man whose massive frame seemed to fill the entire doorway, stepped over the wreckage and leveled his shotgun directly at Frank Costello's throat. His voice was a guttural roar that cut through the ringing in everyone's ears, hands on the table or die. Nobody moves until the Prime Minister gives us what we came for. The reaction in the room was a chaotic blur of panicked movement and frozen terror. The Supreme Court Justice dove under the table, his dignity vanishing in a frantic scramble for cover. One of the rival capos, a hothead from the old school, instinctively reached for the snub-nosed .38 tucked into his waistband. It was the last mistake he would ever make. The lead gunman didn't hesitate, he fired a single 12-gauge slug that caught the capo in the shoulder, spinning him like a rag doll and slamming him against the mahogany sideboard. The sound of the blast in the confined space was deafening, a physical blow that left everyone's ears bleeding. The smell of acrid gunpowder and fresh blood immediately replaced the scent of cigars. Frank Costello, however, remained as still as a statue. He didn't dive for cover. He didn't reach for a weapon. He kept his hands flat on the green felt, his fingers mere inches away from the $1 million pot. He looked at the smoking barrel of the shotgun and then slowly raised his eyes to the man behind the mask. He wasn't looking at a robber, he was looking at a traitor. He noticed that his own personal bodyguards, the men he paid $10,000 a week to protect his life, were standing perfectly still by the back exit, their weapons holstered and their eyes fixed on the floor. The betrayal was total. The Prime Minister had been sold out in his own sanctuary. In that heartbeat, the world slowed down into a series of calculated risks. Costello realized that this wasn't a heist for the money. If they wanted the $1 million, they would have already started shoveling it into bags. They were here for the man. The lead gunman walked toward Costello, the heat from the shotgun muzzle radiating against Costello's skin. He pressed the cold steel into the center of Costello's chest, right over his heart. "You've had a long run, Frank," the gunman hissed, his voice trembling with a lethal mixture of adrenaline and fear. "But Veto is tired of waiting for his turn. Give us the keys to the offshore ledgers, or we'll leave your brains on these cards. You've got 5 seconds before I turn this suit into a shroud." The other gamblers were sobbing or praying, the reality of their impending execution finally sinking in. But Costello's pulse remained steady. He felt the weight of the gun and saw the fear in the assassin's eyes. A man who is about to kill doesn't talk, a man who is talking is looking for a reason not to pull the trigger. If you are watching this and you realize that the most dangerous moment of your life is also the moment where you have the absolute most leverage, then you have the mind of a true kingpin. Most people react to a threat with raw, blinding emotion, but the elite, the ones who truly rule the shadows, react with calculated, ice-cold intent. We are dissecting the life of a man who looked down the throat of a shotgun and saw a business opportunity. If you want to learn how to turn a betrayal into a battlefield advantage, if you want to understand why the whisper of a strategist is more lethal than the shout of a gunman, then you are exactly where you belong. Hit that subscribe button right now to join our inner circle of high-stakes thinkers. Like this video to show that you value the resilience of the mind over the clumsiness of the lead. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type "cold-blooded" in all caps. Let's see who among you is ready to keep their head when the doors are being kicked in. Now, let's go back to the moment Costello decided to end the gunman's career without moving a single muscle. Costello's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, steady rasp that seemed to vibrate through the table. It wasn't the voice of a victim, it was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. "The ledgers aren't here, kid," Costello said, his gaze drilling into the gunman's mask. "And even if they were, you wouldn't live long enough to read the first page. Do you really think Vito Genovese is going to let the men who murdered the Prime Minister walk around as loose ends? You're not his soldiers. You're his clean-up crew. The moment you pull that trigger, the men standing behind you, who my guards who you think you bought, have orders to execute you so Vito can claim he avenged me. You're walking into a grave that's already been dug." The gunman's hand flickered. It was a microscopic movement, a slight tremor in the trigger finger, but it was all Costello needed. He had planted the seed of doubt in a room filled with paranoia. He looked past the lead gunman at his own bodyguards. "Is that right, boys? Are you going to let this amateur finish the job? Or are you wondering if Vito's check is actually going to clear once I'm gone?" The silence that followed was more heavy than the sound of the explosion. The gunmen began to look at each other, the unity of the hit fracturing under the weight of Costello's words. Outside, the distant, rising wail of sirens began to cut through the night, the NYPD's tactical response, likely triggered by the breaching charge. Costello didn't miss a beat. "That's the city's finest," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "They'll be here in 2 minutes. If you're found here with a dead boss and $1 million, you're going to the chair. But if you leave now, through the service tunnel I built for exactly this reason, you might survive the night. Leave the guns. Leave the money. Run while you still have legs." The gunmen were caught in a psychological pincer move. They were trapped between the police, the betrayal they feared from their own employer, and the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man they had come to kill. The lead gunman looked at the pile of money, then at Costello's ice-cold eyes, and finally at his own men. The pressure was too much. The invincible hitmen were now just scared kids in overcoats. With a curse, the leader lowered his shotgun. He didn't say a word. He signaled to his crew, and they scrambled toward the back exit, abandoning their weapons in the dust and debris. They fled into the laundry tunnels of the hotel, disappearing into the darkness just as the first police hammers began to strike the outer perimeter. The room was suddenly quiet, save for the moans of the wounded capo and the frantic breathing of the survivors. Costello didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He slowly reached out, picked up the final card from the deck, and flipped it over. He had the winning hand. He looked at the dock official, who was staring at him in absolute awe. "I believe I doubled the bet," Costello said, tapping the green felt. "Are you going to pay me, or do we have to wait for the police to count it for us?" But the night was far from over. As the police finally burst through the ruins of the door, Costello knew that the card game was just the opening act. He had survived the heist, but he had discovered a rot in his organization that went deeper than he had ever imagined. His bodyguards were still standing there, their faces pale, realizing that they had backed the wrong horse. Costello stood up, brushed the plaster dust from his shoulders, and prepared to face the law. He had $1 million in chips, a room full of witnesses, and a list of names in his head that were marked for a different kind of execution. The Prime Minister was no longer looking for peace. He was looking for a purge. The cards were off the table, and the real blood was about to be spilled on the streets of New York. The smoke from the tactical breach had barely cleared when the first wave of NYPD officers swarmed into the basement. They expected to find a massacre. Instead, they found Frank Costello sitting calmly at a table worth $1 million, lighting a fresh cigar. The Prime Minister didn't look like a man who had just been inches away from a shotgun blast. He looked like the owner of the building waiting for a late appointment. As the detectives began barking orders and securing the perimeter, Costello's mind was already miles ahead of the sirens. He knew that the gunmen were already halfway through the laundry tunnels, and he knew exactly why they had dropped their weapons. But his immediate problem wasn't the assassins, it was the two men standing behind him. His personal bodyguards, the men he had trusted with his life for a decade, were now the most dangerous people in the room. They had stood still while a hit was attempted on their boss. In the underworld, silence is a confession. Costello stood up, brushed a fleck of plaster from his lapel, and looked the lead detective, a man he had personally put through law school 20 years prior, straight in the eye. "It's a robbery, Mike," Costello said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's. "Standard stick-up. I don't want to press charges, and I certainly don't want a circus. Clear the room, and let's talk about how we're going to keep this out of the morning papers." Within an hour, the legal part of the night was over. Money had changed hands, favors had been called in, and the Waldorf Astoria was once again just a luxury hotel. But the real night was just beginning. Costello was driven to a private warehouse in the meatpacking district, a cold, cavernous space where the scent of frozen beef was being overtaken by the smell of industrial cleaning fluid. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb, were the two bodyguards. They weren't standing anymore. They were tied to heavy steel chairs, their faces pale under the harsh light. Costello walked into the room, his silk suit still immaculate, and didn't say a word. He pulled a small, silver pocket watch from his vest and began to time the silence. He knew that for men like these, the anticipation of pain is far more effective than the pain itself. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the dripping of a nearby pipe and the ragged, terrified breathing of the traitors. Finally, Costello leaned in, his face inches from the lead guard's ear. "I don't care how much Vito promised you," he whispered, a sound like sandpaper on glass. "I want to know how he contacted you. I want the names of every man who knew about tonight. If you speak now, you might see the sunrise. If you don't, you're just another piece of meat in a cold room." While the interrogation was happening in the shadows, Costello's invisible hand was already moving across the city. He realized that Vito Genovese's greatest weakness was his greed. Genovese had spent millions to bribe Costello's guards and hire professional shooters. He was leveraged, waiting for the Waldorf heist to pay for his war. Costello decided to hit him where it hurt most, the ledger. From a secure rotary phone in the back of the warehouse, Costello made 3 calls. He didn't call for hitmen. He called for inspectors. Within 90 minutes, 4 of Genovese's biggest illegal gambling dens in the Bronx and East Harlem were raided, not by the mob, but by the city's health and fire departments, backed by the very police units Costello controlled. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. Costello wasn't just taking Genovese's money, he was destroying his infrastructure. He had the power lines cut, the buildings condemned, and the cash seized by the state. By 4 a.m., Genovese had lost over $3 million in projected revenue and his most profitable locations were boarded up with city-issued tape. Costello was proving a point that every strategist must learn: you don't always have to kill your enemy to defeat them, sometimes, you just have to make it too expensive for them to exist. He was suffocating Genovese's empire with the very laws Genovese thought he was above. In the high-stakes game of power, the loudest move is usually the weakest. The man who shouts kill has already lost the negotiation. The man who whispers bankrupt is the one who rules the morning. If you are watching this and you are starting to see the sheer, cold brilliance of a man who can turn a betrayal into a tactical victory, then you are developing the eyes of a master. Most leaders would have sent a car full of gunmen to Genovese's house, starting a war that would have landed everyone in prison. But Costello understood that the Prime Minister doesn't fight in the streets, he fights in the systems. He used the law, the economy, and the fear of his own subordinates to dismantle a coup without firing a single shot himself. If you want to learn how to identify the rot in your own organization, how to turn a traitor into a tool, then you need to be a part of this channel. Subscribe right now to join the only community that deconstructs the world's most dangerous minds. Like this video to show that you value the silent purge over the loud massacre. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type Chessmaster in all caps. Let's see who among you is ready to play the long game. Now, let's go back to the warehouse for the final, chilling resolution of the Waldorf betrayal. The lead guard finally broke. The names poured out of him like water from a burst pipe, capos, city officials, and street soldiers who had all been promised a piece of the Costello empire once the old man was gone. Costello listened, nodding slightly as each name confirmed a suspicion he had held for months. He realized that Genovese hadn't just attacked him, he had attempted to rewire the entire power structure of the city. When the guard was finished, he looked at Costello with pleading eyes. "I told you everything, Frank. Please. I have a family." Costello looked at him, his expression unreadable. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stack of $100 bills, and placed them in the guard's lap. "You're right," Costello said. "You did tell me everything. And because of that, your family will receive your pension. But you won't be there to spend it." Costello turned his back and walked toward the exit. As the heavy steel door slammed shut, the loyalists he had brought from the coat room stepped forward. The sound of 2 muffled shots was drowned out by the roar of a passing garbage truck outside. The rot had been removed. By 6 a.m., Frank Costello was back in his penthouse at the Majestic, watching the sun rise over Central Park. He was exhausted, but he was victorious. He had survived a hit, liquidated the traitors, and cost his greatest rival millions of dollars, all in the span of 8 hours. He picked up his telephone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It was Vito Genovese's private line. When the other man answered, his voice thick with sleep and the expectation of good news, Costello didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "Vito, I'm still holding the winning hand. The Waldorf is closed, your Bronx clubs are gone, and your boys are in the ground. Don't ever bet against the house again. It's bad for business." He hung up before Genovese could utter a single word. The aftermath of the Waldorf raid changed the underworld forever. It proved that Costello wasn't just a diplomat, he was a shark who knew how to use the civilized world as a weapon. He didn't just survive a card game, he reclaimed the entire deck. The message was clear to everyone from the docks of Brooklyn to the boardrooms of Wall Street: you can try to kill the Prime Minister, but you better be prepared to lose everything you own in the process. Costello had turned a moment of absolute vulnerability into a demonstration of total dominance. He had played $1 million bluff and walked away with the whole city. As we look back at the night of the Waldorf, we see the blueprint for modern influence. Costello's success was built on the fact that he was more necessary than his enemies. He controlled the judges, the police, and the unions. He was the glue that held the city together, and by attempting to remove him, Genovese had nearly caused the entire system to collapse. Costello didn't just protect himself, he protected the business. And in the world of power, the man who protects the business is the man who never truly dies. He died in 1973 as a private citizen, a legend who had outlived every man who ever tried to take his seat. The final lesson of the Prime Minister is one of extreme discipline. He could have let emotion take over. He could have started a bloodbath. Instead, he stayed calm, stayed calculated, and stayed in control. He proved that the most powerful move is the one that restores order while destroying your enemies. If you can learn to keep your hands on the table when the doors are splintering, if you can learn to look at a gunman and see a pawn, then you have mastered the game of life. Frank Costello didn't just win the hand at the Waldorf, he proved that as long as he was in the room, the house always, inevitably, wins.